Rachel and Long, should we get the second session started? We have all the panelists here.
Yep, I think that sounds good.
All right. Welcome back for the second session of our panel discussion. Good morning. My name is Simon Lin. I'm the Chief Research Information Officer at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Our second panel is about how can we write grants and get funded on our AI studies. We have a distinguished list of 3 panelists joining this session. All those 3 panelists, they are not only leaders in their own field of research, excellent grant writers, but they are also experienced reviewers for the NIH grants. For this session, we have a similar format to the previous session. Each of the panelists will have 20 minutes for a short presentation. I will introduce each panelist individually, and afterward, there is a question and answer session. One major feature for this panelist is we have an extended Q&A answer session for 1.5 hours. So please do write down your questions, put them into the question and answer box, and we will have good time and enough time to answer all of your questions. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Dr. Philip Payne. He is the Associate Dean of Health Information and Data Science at Washington University School of Medicine. He's also the Janet and Bernard Becker Professor and Director of the Institute of Informatics and the Chief Data Scientist at Washington University School of Medicine. Dr. Payne responsible for the creation and oversight of comprehensive biomedical informatics and data science research, training and support programs aligned with health and life science enterprise. He's an elected fellow of ACMI, the AMIA, and the AIMBE. His research portfolio broadly focused upon the area of translational bioinformatics and clinical research informatics. Dr. Payne, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Simon, for that thoroughly embarrassing introduction. A lot of detail, and always happy to be back with my friends and colleagues at The Ohio State University, where I am still actually an adjunct faculty member as well. So definitely a place that I have a lot of fondness for. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, and hopefully everyone can see these okay. So I'm going to start out with really, as the sort of topic of this panel is intended to be, some broad guidelines, and really what I'm going to describe as 10 simple rules to consider when writing funding proposals in the informatics and data science domain. Now, actually, a lot of the advice I'm going to try to give you all is broadly applicable to many different types of funding proposals, but I will give some specific examples that are really relevant to informatics and data science proposals. So with that, I guess for starters, this is the obligatory disclosure slide, and I would say you should not trust anything I tell you, apparently. I often make the joke that when I give a talk on one of the coasts, people look at this slide and say, that's it. But when I give a talk in the Midwest, everyone becomes very suspicious. So I will ask you to judge appropriately. Although I will draw your attention, a lot of the comments I'm going to make are going to come from my experience most recently as a member of what was BCHI, now CDMA, which is the primary study section under CSR that reviews clinical informatics and digital health proposals on behalf of the NIH, actually works in close coordination with the standing study section of the National Library of Medicine as well. And Judith actually can speak to that in equal measure. And I guess notably, and I should disclose, as of October, I'll be the chair of that study section. So I'm also speaking, I guess, from a perspective of someone that wants to see more high quality proposals showing up for our esteemed group of reviewers to provide their feedback on. So that's a lot of the framing of this. And I will share, I previously served as a standing member of the National Library of Medicine study section as well, so have experience that I draw upon in that regard. So if you take nothing else, I am not good at saying no when the NIH asks if I want to be a member of a study section. So I think this is kind of common knowledge, but I do think it's important to frame up the conversation and talk about the funding proposal life cycle. And in all honesty, I think there's a lot of sort of urban myth and legend that surrounds what it takes to get a funding proposal through this life cycle, especially for early stage investigators. But the thing I want you to take away from this diagram is, first and foremost, the bulk of the work happens before you ever write a funding proposal. Because for better or for worse, even in those types of funding mechanisms that are considered high risk and do not require a lot of preliminary data, by and large, successful funding proposals build on existing work, even in those areas. And certainly for R01s and other larger, more programmatic funding mechanisms, this is even more the case. The other thing I want you to take away from this life cycle is it takes a lot of iterations to get funded. And that does not change no matter how senior or accomplished you are. And actually something that I think many of my colleagues and I talk about frequently is whether or not, we are sufficiently transparent about the numbers of applications many of us submit versus those that are successful. Because the reality is that a successful funding proposal has usually gone through at least, one or two iterations of this cycle before it gets within sort of a fundable scoring range. So you should expect that. That should be a normative aspect of the funding life cycle. And I think, again, I just want to demystify that. And I think, at the end of the day, we are working in a business where the success rate, when you look across sort of the broad NIH portfolio, has maintained a sort of percentile range below 10% for the last almost 5 years, now going on 6 years, if you look at sort of the relevant statistics from NIH. That is a very low success rate. And even with some of the benefits that we afford to early stage investigators and new investigators, that may only bring that up to maybe 15 or 18%. So the takeaway is you need to be prepared for and plan for many of these iterations. So I'm going to get right into the core of the material. And again, this is all my opinion as a person who writes proposals and reviews proposals, and others may feel free to disagree with me, but I just want to sort of start out with sort of a version of what actually was a really great article published in 2006 in PLOS Computational Biology entitled 10 Simple Rules for Getting Grants. And this is kind of the Philip Payne version of these 10 simple rules, particularly as applied to clinical informatics and data science. So the first rule is really that you want to be novel, but you don't want to be too novel. And I know that sounds like a very sort of fuzzy rule, but let me explain. There's always a risk in funding proposals that you will be seen as being incremental in terms of your advancement of the relevant sort of theories and methods. And therefore, you do need some high risk and high yield aspects of your proposal. Simultaneously, if your entire proposal is high risk and high yield, you are opening the door to criticism that there is a high probability of failure, right? So you basically end up in this very narrow window in between being novel and being incremental that's likely to be fundable. And I often tell people that I think the magic ratio in this regard is a 70-30 split. About 70% of what you propose in the funding proposal should be based upon theories and methods and preliminary data, and I'll get to that in a minute, that when a reviewer looks at it, they say, there's a high probability of success. Either this team has done work that demonstrates that they can be successful, or there's existing work that's in the published literature that demonstrates that this approach to the problem at hand is likely to produce the kinds of outcomes that are being described. 30% of the proposal should be the high risk, high yield component. This is where you're really pushing the envelope and sort of advancing the theoretical and methodologic basis of the field. And these should be tightly linked to one another, but not linked in such a way that the 30% that's high risk and high yield creates a single point of failure whereby the 70% no longer is feasible. And that actually goes to one of my favorite comments as a reviewer, which is you do not want to have a linear research plan, where if you have a single point of failure, the remainder of your research plan is no longer able to be executed, right? So that's a situation where, say, your high risk, high reward aim is aim number 1. And if you are not successful in doing it, aims 2+ in your research plan will not be able to be executed subsequently. That's a dangerous proposition and frankly, a fatal flaw in most funding proposals when they get to the study section. So again, you want to be novel, but you don't want to be too novel. And unfortunately, I'd like to give you a little bit more specificity about this, but this is somewhat in the eye of the beholder based on the domain, the problem, and your own sort of body of preliminary work and expertise. Second, I think this is a place where a lot of people, and particularly in clinical informatics and digital health proposals, lose sight of the opportunity that is afforded by 2 specific components of the proposal. So one is the significance section and the other is the innovation section. And I feel like people tend to use the significance section largely as a way to sort of recapitulate the current literature or domain state of the art. And they use the innovation section to respond directly to the innovation criteria that are enumerated in the funding announcement. However, there's an opportunity here to tell a story. And I'm going to get to another rule in a moment, which is about understanding sort of the psychology of your reviewers. But between the significance and the innovation sections, you have an opportunity to tell the reviewers a story, which begins with, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? Why should anyone care about it? What's been done before? What hasn't been done? And how is what I'm proposing in this application going to fill that gap? This is something that anyone, even someone who's not familiar with informatics, data science, artificial intelligence, any of the theories or methods that we're talking about today, should be able to understand. They should be able to understand that story. Why is the problem important? What has been done before? What are the gaps? And how are you going to tackle them? And this is a story that can be told in the significance and innovation sections. And in fact, I know a lot of people, when they write grants, they write their specific aims and they want to jump right to writing the approach. I actually tell my junior faculty, write the significance and innovation sections before you ever start writing your approach, because they'll help you to frame up the way in which you will present your approach based upon that narrative arc that I just presented. So now I've combined 2 other rules together for the sake of time and efficiency, which is about aligning with funding programs and guidelines. So one of the things is you actually need to understand the funding mechanisms that you are responding to. And if you read the RFAs, there's always sort of, to use sort of a euphemism, little Easter eggs in there about what the sort of NIH or the funding agency is really looking for. And you really need to look at, where does that funding announcement deviate? And this is, by the way, if you're applying to something that's not the parent grant mechanism. But where does that funding mechanism deviate from what's in the parent grant or other grants in this area? Because it's those variations that give you an insight into what the funding agency is really looking to pay for, right? So you really need to read in excruciating detail to find those. There's no way around that. And unfortunately, these are voluminous and painful documents to read. The other thing is, there are guidelines in these documents, and they tell you specific questions that you actually have to answer. I cannot tell you the number of times, especially with very specific funding announcements in sort of the informatics and data science domain, where people fail to answer those questions. That is a surefire way to end up with a very bad critique from the study section, because there will always be someone on the study section will look at that. I often joke that there are 3 types of reviewers, and you would hope that you get an even balance of these types, but you don't always get this. You get somebody who's the champion. They're the reviewer that likes the idea and is going to fight for your proposal. You get somebody who is what I like to refer to as the accountant, and they're going to go and look at each data point and each piece of preliminary data and each aspect of your sort of approach, and they're going to pick apart any inconsistencies there. And then the third person is the rule follower. And the rule follower is just basically going to say, did you punch all of sort of the required, tickets that were in that funding announcement? And if you happen to get a rule follower and an accountant in those 2 archetypes that I just described, and you haven't answered every question or every point of review that are enumerated in the funding announcement, you're in trouble. And I will tell you that these sort of informatics and data science funding proposals tend to have pages and pages in the back, usually, of very specific criteria that they expect you to respond to. And they're almost always embedded in that review criteria section. You need to understand that. And if you don't do it, you can have a perfectly good idea get completely taken off course during the review process because of a discussion by the accountant and by the rule follower in that study section environment. Now, this is probably the most important piece of advice I'm going to give you, which is what is known in this article and that I've sort of expanded on is the 3 C's, right? The funding proposal needs to be concise. It needs to be clear and complete. So let's work through that. So concise. First of all, it needs to be easy to read. So guess what? If you try to jam every piece of information into 6 or 12 pages that you can and use crazy formatting tricks and game the system from a font size standpoint and how you format your references and margins and everything else, you are producing a difficult to read proposal. Now, I think maybe Judith and I would agree, like we're in the midst of doing preliminary critiques right now for an upcoming study section. And I will tell you, reviewers get cranky when the proposal is difficult to read. Make the proposal easy to read. And that means not putting any more information than is necessary in order to answer the questions and convey that narrative arc that I just talked about based upon the problem you're trying to solve and the funding program that you're responding to. So this is an art. It's actually hard to write less. It's actually easier to write more. But if you write more and you put all that content in their proposal, you will end up with grumpy reviewers. Number 2, you need to be clear. Most important rule here, assume nothing. There's not a guarantee that the reviewer that you're going to get is going to be a world-class expert in your area. They're going to have relevant expertise. That's why they're in the study section. But they may not be, the expert in the problem area that you are focusing on. So you have to present your work in such a way that is very easily understood. One of my pet peeves, people that basically say, this is well established and here's 14 references. Okay, I, as a reviewer, am not going to go read those 14 papers. You need to convince me in a synopsis of what that prior work means and provide the references to justify that there's peer-reviewed literature that sort of backs up that argument. But if you assume that I'm going to read all the cross-reference literature in order to understand the fundamental premise of your funding proposal, you have gone off course. You also have to be careful with jargon and acronyms. Another pet peeve. If I have to keep on going back to the first page of the proposal to get the secret decoder ring of all the acronyms that you've used to save space in your proposal, and this is particularly true in clinical informatics and digital health proposals, I'm going to be a cranky reviewer. So really the clear part's about don't create cranky reviewers. And then completeness, and we just talked about this a moment ago. This is about sort of mapping to whatever the funding announcement or program is, and importantly, directing reviewers to key criteria. So I just told you not to game the system from a formatting standpoint, but now I'm going to tell you a place where you should game the system from a formatting standpoint. There are review criteria enumerated in the funding announcement. You can use things like formatting of your text, say bold and italics, to provide your reviewers with direct answers to those questions. That makes their life easier when they're trying to fill out their critique of your proposal. Draw their attention to the salient arguments that respond to those review criteria. Give them a roadmap in your proposal. And then this call out on the other side of the slide. You have to think beyond the research plan. There are other documents that people tend to treat sort of as icing on the cake, and they lose the opportunity to use those documents to make their case, including your data or resource sharing plans. By the way, in an informatics or data science proposal, if that's like one paragraph, you're missing the mark, right? You need to write a full and comprehensive data and resource sharing plan. Same thing with an MPI plan if there's multiple PIs or PDs. Human subjects, let me tell you something. If you are going to do usability testing, or you are going to have subject matter experts involved in your project, guess what? It's human subjects research. People commonly say that they're going to do that. I'm going to engage in iterative user-centered design of my intervention. And then they get to the human subject section and they say, not human subjects research. Guaranteed fatal flaw in your proposal. It is human subjects research. You need to write a plan. And if you don't know how to write one, then you need to find your colleagues that do and make sure you follow a good template. Same thing with facilities. You can make a case of facilities. If you give me a 20-page facility document that explains everything going on in your institution, I'm not going to read that. But if you give me a clear and concise facility document that actually relates to what you're going to do, fantastic. Letters of support, also an opportunity to add more content that doesn't fit in your 6 to 12 pages or more. And then finally, in career development awards, sort of the career development mentoring plans. People always want to write the research plan, and they don't spend anywhere near enough time on the career development and mentoring components. And that tends to be where they lose traction from a scoring standpoint, especially in K-23s and equivalent. Spend time. In fact, I would argue that the career development and mentoring plans in many ways are more important than the research plan. The study section, by and large, is willing to allow for a little bit less robust research plan for an early stage investigator if the career development plan is really solid, and we believe this is sort of setting that individual up to be an independent, successful investigator. So don't underestimate these documents, and don't leave them until 48 hours before your deadline to write in a rush, because these are important documents that can augment that narrative arc that I described before. I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again. Rule number 6, remember that reviewers are people too. They're tired and they're cranky. Our study sections, such as the former BCHI, now CDMA, we can have upwards of, 100 to 110 proposals for a 2-day study section. And even after streamlining, the math actually doesn't add up. You actually can't get through all the proposals in the time that's allocated. It's an incredibly taxing process. If you make it hard for the reviewers to find this information in your proposal and they get grumpy, that's going to make it worse. The reviewers get tired. So give them a roadmap. I often tell people to put a figure at the beginning of their approach section that shows how all the components in their proposal link together into one cohesive whole. And that's a roadmap that allows a reviewer that's new to your proposal to navigate the content. And again, highlight those scorable criteria. And don't sort of assume that your reviewers know all the prior background that is sort of the foundations for your work. Provide enough of a synopsis so they can understand that what you're proposing fits that 70-30 rule that I talked about before. So again, you have to remember that your reviewers are people. Timing and internal review are important. I don't think, especially for junior faculty, anybody should submit a proposal for extramural funding that hasn't gone through some sort of internal review. If you're at an institution like the places that are represented here today, and you have a CTSA, you have a mock study section or mock study sections, the same in the cancer domain. You should send your proposals there. If there's not a mock study section, then your department, center, institute, whatever your home is, should create one. Because there's no reason to have sort of giveaway errors in your proposal that couldn't have been captured by internal experts at your organization. It also means you have to plan ahead. You can't write everything at sort of the 11th hour. You need to write, you need to identify those opportunities and line that up, assemble your proposals, go through internal review, assume you're going to cycle a few times, and do that before you submit, because you have like 1 or 2 chances once you submit, honestly, to get funded, especially in this highly competitive space. Put in the most competitive proposal the first time you come in, which means you should use these internal review resources. A lot of people look at this as a burden or almost sort of a gate that they have to get through within their institution, and they tend to be annoyed by this. This is actually a positive thing. I think the reason why people get annoyed is because they don't plan their timeline sufficiently in advance, and so they haven't anticipated the additional effort and time required to engage in internal review. Another thing, and this is a huge mistake, and certainly in these diverse funding announcements that tackle our field, you actually need to know your program officer or SRO. If you are submitting a funding proposal to a program and you have not talked to the program officer or the SRO once or twice before you've actually submitted your proposal, then you've done something wrong. Your program officer and SRO are like the Rosetta Stone, to sort of paraphrase this graphic, to help you map sort of what's in that funding announcement and the scoring criteria to what the institutions actually want. They'll tell you if you're responsive or not, if you share your specific aims. They'll tell you about things that you should highlight. It turns out, contrary to what many people think, the POs and SROs actually want to fund you. That is their job, right? They want to give out money for people to do high impact research. I think a lot of people are afraid, but you can literally send them an email. Look in the funding announcement. Their names are right there. Send them an email and say, hey, can I have a phone call? And here's a draft of specific aims. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, they'll get on the phone for 30 or 60 minutes and give you very concrete feedback. You should not be an unknown when you submit your proposal. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This is a common issue. People say, oh, great funding announcement. I'm going to write a proposal and submit it. Hopefully they'll like it. No, you should be a known quantity to the PO or SROs before you submit. Number 9, now this is a controversial topic because I know there's probably some senior faculty here that will disagree with me, but I refer to this as the take a look behind the curtain rule. So everybody should volunteer, in my opinion, to be a reviewer if they're offered the opportunity to do it. Nothing will demystify the review process more for you than sitting on a study section, okay? Now, some people say, well, it's a lot of work, and if you're a junior faculty member, you should be spending that time on writing your proposals. You're right. except your likelihood of success in this sub 10% sort of success rate world is greatly enhanced if you actually understand what happens when a grant is being reviewed. You can do it at your own institution, right, through a sort of mock study section, or you can do it if you're invited as an ad hoc reviewer. And by the way, those calls that I talked about with your sort of SROs or POs, where you try to, set up your proposal for success, also an opportunity to indicate to them that you're interested in ad hoc review opportunities. Everyone starts as an ad hoc reviewer before they become a standing study section member. That's just the system, right? And then suddenly you'll be able to, sort of demystify like the scoring scheme, because it turns out like the words in this table that NIH shares with you about what these scores mean really aren't what they mean. So for example, anything in that 1, 2, or 3 range, we're basically saying we think this is fundable. There's probably some things we want you to tweak. But if you're in the 1, 2, or 3 range, we're feeling pretty good about it. If you're in the 4, 5, or 6 range, now it's a little more complicated. In the 4 range, we're probably saying go back and do some significant work and resubmit. As you get into 5 or 6, your study section is actually starting to send you a message, which is, you may need to significantly rework this or not bring it back at all. And by the way, if you get a 7, 8, or 9, that means you've upset the study section. That usually means that you have not responded to the funding announcement, and we are upset because you have taken time to review a proposal that patently is non-responsive. I see Judith laughing, but it's true, right? If you get a 7, 8, or 9, I mean, people have to be pretty cranky to give you that score. You learn these things by going into a study section and listening to the process. And by the way, listening to the process whereby there's a negotiation amongst the various study section members when you get to sort of a final score. So this is something I think is really, really important. I know not always commonly agreed upon, but something I would like you all to consider. And then lastly, and I suffer from this in the 10 simple rules, you need to accept rejection and learn from it, okay? So everyone fails in the funding game. And you get back reviews where you're like, oh my goodness, what just happened? Now, I will tell you, I treat it sort of like the stages of like grieving, right? So the first time when you open up your sort of summary statement, I don't know about you, but I tend to get angry, like they didn't even try to understand my proposal, right? That is not the time to plan how you're going to revise your application. Read it, get upset, walk away from it. Then usually I think there's sort of a stage 2. You come back and you look at it again and you're like, oh, I am never going to get this funded. That's the depression stage. That's when you're like, okay, this is just sad. My great idea has been totally destroyed by the study section. Do that, walk away again. Come back the 3rd time. That's the resignation and sort of, next step phase, which is like time to get back to work. And I will share with everyone one of the tricks that I use. When I get to stage 3, I write my own notes, which are the version of the critique, like what needs to be changed. And then I don't go back and read the study section comments again because they make me upset. I just work from my own punch list. So when I get to stage 3, I'm working from my list of revisions, which is sort of a synopsis of what the critique said, because I don't want to look at that document anymore where those, cranky study section members gave me all that feedback that clearly showed that they didn't understand what I was proposing. This is normal. Even our most successful investigators in our field are submitting, dozens of proposals a year and only 1 or 2 are successful. So, you may think to yourself, like, this is an awful experience. Everyone is struggling with this. It's not just you. And I don't know that we're always as transparent about that as we should be. And then lastly, I want to shift to one final and critical point, which is something that's really foundational to the types of proposals that we're talking about today in sort of clinical informatics, data science, and artificial intelligence, which is that when you are writing about the use of these advanced computational methods, you need to, in that narrative arc, address 4 fundamental questions concerning the use of AI in a biomedical or clinical context, right? So first and foremost, and this is sort of paraphrasing a paper that my colleague Tom Maddox and I wrote a couple years ago in JAMA, you need to be able to answer the question, is this task even appropriate for the use of artificial intelligence? That includes machine learning, deep learning, cognitive computing methods. There are so many proposals where people are like, machine learning is awesome, I'm going to apply it to this problem. And they haven't even really made the case why machine learning is the right path to solving that problem. You need to explain why the task is fit for the application of AI. And if you don't, you're missing an opportunity to sell your idea. If you do make that case, the next thing that you have to do is you got to make sure that you also, in equal measure, argue that you have the right data to support your approach. Because you could have a really good idea and it's appropriate for the use of AI and you know what methods to use, but you don't have the right data. And that right data includes not only access to data, but the ability to label that data. So here's like a pro tip. You know, if you have a large unlabeled data set and you say, I'm going to have subject matter experts label that data, and then you don't put a single subject matter expert on your budget, and you're just going to assume people are going to do that out of the goodness of your heart, the study section is not going to believe that you're going to end up with labeled data because people aren't volunteers. So if you have that problem, you need to plan for and explain how you're going to produce a labeled data set. The third thing that you have to address, and this is sort of something that's my personal sort of, I guess, hill that I would die on in the study section, is what's the right evidence standard? You need to explain what you're going to compare the output of your AI agent to, whatever your predictive model or other methodology is. Is there a human gold standard? Is there some other comparator out there? Because if you just say, I'm going to build it and I'm going to say that this model is super accurate and therefore it's going to be great for clinical decision support, I'm not going to believe you. I'm going to want to know, how are clinicians making that decision today in the absence of that AI intervention? And how does your intervention compare to it? Because if you can't answer that, you're not going to meet the evidence standard required to sort of even contemplate translation into the clinical environment. And then finally, you have to be able to say something about how this is going to be integrated back into the clinical care environment. If this is about something that's meant to be clinically actionable, you need to show that you understand what that truly means, right? So you could have like this really great model that you've described and no mechanism for making it explainable, for visualizing it, for integrating it with an EHR. You haven't even thought about the workflow. And I often say this to, you know, junior investigators, like, what clinical problem are you trying to solve? Like, are there providers asking for this? You know, could they actually use this in the clinical environment? So if you can't answer those questions, you could have a really great model or algorithm and it's still a failure. And I tell people, you know, algorithmic performance does not equal success in clinical informatics and digital health. Algorithmic performance plus adoption and utilization by real-world end users and then demonstrable changes in quality, safety, and outcomes of care, that's the formula for success in digital health interventions. And you need to be able to make the case. Now, you might not be able to solve all of that in your funding proposal. But you certainly need to speak to how that would be solved in the future, perhaps building off of what you're going to do in the immediate proposal. And that's an okay answer, right? You don't have to boil the ocean to be metaphoric, but you better show that you understand that that's a problem, that you have a plan to address it over time. And I think that's it for right now. I know we have lots of Q&A today, but you're also always welcome to shoot me an email or take a look on Twitter as well. I promise only science and technology on Twitter. The occasional college football reference, but for the Ohio State crowd, it's actually because I'm still a Buckeye fan, so you will be okay in that regard. And with that, I'll sort of wrap up and hand things over.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. Our next speaker is Dr. Long Li from Ohio State University. He's the chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics. Prior to that, Dr. Li was endowed chair at the Indiana University School of Medicine. Dr. Li has developed an international reputation for the use of biomedical informatics and system pharmacology to evaluate drug efficacies and adverse drug events. His translational research has been extensively funded. As an investigator and the co-investigator, he's on 12 research awards. That's total more than 2 million a year in funding. Welcome, Dr. Li.
Thank you so much, Simon. All right, I will, I only have 12 slides, put it this way. I'm anticipating more discussion time. And unfortunately, Philip actually talked a lot about CDMA study section already, so I don't have to emphasize too much about that study section. In my talk, I'm probably gonna focus a bit more on how do I review the predictive models and computational analysis in the proposal. I think that's very important things I can share with my experience. All right, so first of all, you know, when a CDMA start section, there are a number of proposals building models, and I can lay out a few examples. I think that's where people can get some familiarity of the culture of the CDMA. You know, the most popular predictive model is really using EMR data, develop predictive model for disease risk or a therapeutic outcome or success rate of hospital operation. Then there's also using EMR data. In this case, focusing on the unstructured data, literature data, and sometimes social media data, develop NLP algorithms for either cohort indication, knowledge discovery. These data used for testing hypotheses in clinical studies. Okay. And there is also many proposals I've seen so far is using imaging data developed in the prognostic, diagnostic, predictive tools as well. And there's also I see a lot of proposal using data from a large cohort study, clinical trials, and develop predictive models that stratify disease risk and or predicting therapeutic outcomes. And I believe in the future, if the other data modes become more available, then there's going to be different types of predictive model and the CDMA proposals. There are different, to me, there are two different types of computation models I've seen in the start section. One is the deep learning, machine learning methods. The other one is statistical models, causal inference, multi-state transition models, and other statistical analysis. Okay. And then I'm gonna probably focus on the how do I review the predictive models and computation analysis in the proposal on the 4 different sections: significance, including scientific premises, innovation, approach, investigator, environment. The clinical impact actually was kind of mentioned quite extensively in Philip's slides already. So I'm probably gonna not spend too much time talk about the clinical impact, but on the other 4 areas, I want to spend a bit more time on that. The scientific premises of innovation. There's one scenario that how do we justify the scientific premises and demonstrate innovation? This first scenario though is through the literature review. Okay, demonstrated there's no predictive model has been developed yet in predicting a particular disease risk, right? Then the primary innovation is trying to develop such a predictive model. So you can say that. And even though the computing methodology itself does not have to be innovative, however, the grant proposal must review the literature and choose and justify the best computational option properly. Let me emphasize again, in this case, the computation itself is not necessarily innovation. The true innovation is that in this particular application, there's no such model being developed before. So that's where you can claim the innovation. Okay, that's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, though, is through literature review, demonstrate that the current predictive model is not adequate or optimal in predicting a disease risk. It can be the saying that existing model missing several important risk factors, or there are new data that can be integrated into the model, where by integrating new data, the model can be better, stronger, or has higher performance. Or the modeling and its optimization scheme are outdated. So therefore, we want to have a better, different optimization algorithms, okay? And the primary innovation in the predictive model can be as following. Say, you can say there's a new risk factor in the model, there are new data to help the model improve performance, and there's also new methodology you want to improve the model performance as well. Okay, so that's where you can claim the innovation. Then if the innovation is built upon literature review, preliminary data will be needed to show that the new methodology is better than the existing predictive model in the proposed clinical application. So you have to say this new methodology is better with some preliminary data. How do I review the predictive model in approach? So so there are several areas I feel people should pay attention. When you're talking about the data, you need to talk about sample size, all right, and you need to talk about the data annotation standards. Okay, if there are multiple data sources for testing and validation, please justify why different data sources are comparable for testing and validation. I think this is a common mistake when I see many proposals, even though they are able to put in, multi-institutional data sets, say data from different claims data or EMR data together. But however, they're kind of forget how to justify why the claims data, EMR data are comparable, in terms of defining the clinical endpoints or clinical variables. This is our important points. They have to, you have to say something about it, okay? And secondly, for using the data to build a model, we still need a study design, okay? For example, it is a retrospective cohort study or case control study. We need to say inclusion exclusion criteria. And if you wanted to use a primary outcome variable, if the definition is not readily validated in the literature, then there must be a validation process in the grant proposal. Give you one example, say everybody knows the diabetes, right? But how does diabetes be defined in EHR data? And if you wanted to use a diabetes definition from the literature, which literature tells the validation process and the data about the phenotype itself, that's okay. But if the clinical outcome is not published, okay, so you do it for the first time, right? So if you want to do this, you have to have a validated process in the grant proposal saying that's how we pick the phenotype, and that's how to validate that, okay? And similarly, for the other definition of primary risk factor, potential confounding variables, if those variables are not necessarily well defined in the EHR or in your database, you have to have a process to define it, or if they are published in some way in the literature, you have to sign them, okay? Sample size and the power is always important things to consider in the study design. Finally, there's also adequate details data processing. If the data are integrated from different sources, please state how data are or will be integrated. And please also state how data will be prepared as input data for modeling and analysis. And then this is kind of become a common challenge because, how do we make the data ready for AI? It's just not straightforward. I think there's going to be a lot of language, you need to spell it out in the grant proposal to make it clear to reviewers. Then with the modeling itself is not the primary innovation, and how do you write the model? So I think you're going to start from training data, internal validation data, external validation data. So data description has to be there. And provide verbal description of how predictive model will work and what are the primary difference among them, and where they are cutting edge. Let's say if you proposing a number of models, so you can say I want to do a SCVM, I want to do a convolution neural network model, right? So you have to tell why you want to do two of them. What's the difference between them? A laundry list of models sometimes is not going to help you too much. Okay, then when you talk about it, implementing different models in your grant, you have to say something about implementing details, like what software you're using, and what are input data you want to be able to generate to make it clarify that we understand what you're doing. Okay, then also provide adequate citation, and the citation has to be updated. Let's say if you cite a SCVM paper, say 1919 or 1990, it's probably not as good as put another citation more relevant to your work in the recent years. Okay, so just pay attention to those small details, and also including adequate details of optimal model selection and comparison criteria. I think Philip also mentioned quite a bit about this. You have to say something about what's the best model and how to pick the model and how to make them clinical relevant. Then there are situations we see a lot of grant proposals where they claim the model itself is a primary innovation. All right, and again, you have to start from training data, validation data first. Then then that's where when you're talking about a model, I think, especially when you're starting to talk about a new model, new methodology, and you have to have some annotations, variables on the data, say X, Y, Z. What does it mean? All right. Then if you want to say, okay, my model is different from the other model, then somehow either from statistical aspects or from computer science aspect, you have to say something about it. Is the objective function are different or similar to the existing methodology? And usually for NIH grants, it doesn't allow you to present too much technical detail of your model developments. Okay, so right now we see a lot of proposals which very well written as using a figure, okay, using a figure flow chart. But in the flow chart, you have to pinpoint the primary innovation elements. What are the major difference? Your model is different from the other model. You have to say something about it in the figure to point out, that's the, where that's the major innovation elements I'm doing. Okay, so just give me review some kind of a guidance of what is the review elements. Then I think finally, probably the most difficult thing to say or to write in the grant though is to balance the technical presentation of the model. Okay, if you put too much technical equations, theoretical derivations in the proposal, it's going to confuse the reviewer. Okay, I almost wanted to suggest you, you don't want to talk about asymptotic convergence or theoretical convergence or speed. The speed could be too much for the start section. I think I would rather you not doing that. Instead, I think just using some verbal language to describe the computational process, optimization process, I think will be much more idea for review and understand your computational innovation. Okay. Finally, the implementation details on programming and software package is also very important. Keep in mind that the model can be implemented. If the model can be implemented straightforward using software package, then you really cannot promote it as an innovation model. Okay. And in many new deep learning models require significant amount of work in data preparation, programming before the data can be ready for the model developments. I think this needs to be fully described in the grant proposal. Okay. And the citation and also the details, model selection comparisons are also very important. I think this is universally true for all situations. And then I want to probably say something a bit more about an NLP grant proposal, because NLP grant proposal is somehow different from the other ones. First of all, I think whenever people talk about NLP, people have to say, okay, where are the golden standard come from, right? So somehow you have to review and integrate existing corpus data, regardless the text file you want to come from. Sometimes the text from PubMed, sometimes the text file from the clinical notes, but you have to say something about the existing corpus data. Then if there's no existing corpus, and if you wanted to ask physician or somebody to help you develop golden standard, then a lot more details has to be presented in terms of how do you develop annotation guideline, how do you recruit annotators to do the annotation work, right? And at the end of the day, how do you evaluate the annotation quantity of annotation between annotators? And finally, you have to address the sample size. How big is sample size needed for developing NLP process? Okay, so those are the things I think, especially for NLP related grant proposals, you have to pay attention to that. And an investigator sometimes is also important, because every time we review a grant proposal, we have to go back and see whether the PIs or co-Is have adequate skills for model developments. Okay, so if the predictive model is not necessarily applying innovation, so when I review a proposal, I will focus on the education background of investigator, and the investigator do not have to have first or senior author purpose in which they have applied this method, but they have to have some co-author perhaps using this methodology. Okay, so this is one scenario where the innovation is not necessarily the predictive model itself. It's just an implementation, right? However, if the predictive model is the primary innovation, then I will focus on the first or single author publications in which the investigator has done the methodology developments in the proposed areas. So those are the things I treat them very differently when I evaluate the investigator strengths. Finally, the environment, the letter and facility is very important. And actually, in the first session today, we actually talk about the data accessibility, data sharing capacity. So in the environment or facility equipment document, we have to have that. And we also need high performance computing and data storage capacity, data security, and collaborative history. So those can be reflected through the letter of support and the facility documents in the grant proposal. All right, I think that's all I have. I'm waiting for more questions at the end. Somebody muted.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Our next speaker is Dr. Judith Dexheimer. She is the Associate Professor of Biomedical Informatics at the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Her research is on the use of machine learning to enhance patient and physician experience at the point of care. She has worked on projects on implementing real-time machine learning in a clinical setting and utilize the classifier for epilepsy patients. So Judith, we're looking forward for your talk.
Thank you. I have upgraded my OS and not allowed Zoom yet to share my screen. Can you see my screen? I've told it to share. Okay, I have that it's up. Can you see everything? Okay, Simon. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we'll talk about today is I'm going to kind of also do a large overview, but I'm going to start by stepping what actually happens during the study section. And so what I want to point out is I am from the other split of BCHI. I am on CIDH now, which is the Clinical Informatics and Digital Health Study section. We were all together once and we've been split. I've also done ad hoc reviews for a lot of different study sections. I have the same problem Philip has, is that I am unable to say no when I am called and asked to do reviews. I have my own funding for various sections, but I also am a collaborator on the informatics, other wonderful people's funds. The first I want to do is what happens in a meeting. And so I should mention that your standing study section meets 3 times a year. And with those 3 times a year, your standing reviewers will have somewhere between grants to review, critique, and submit the critiques prior to the meeting. So you can do the math so that you know that people have between 24 and 30 grants of various types that they're reviewing every single year. And this is why things tend to make us cranky when they are not fully looked at. So what I want to say about this is Philip and Lang have already discussed a lot of the specifics about the review process and some of the general guidance on things that happen. I'm actually going to focus on scoring your proposal. So this first step, what happens in the meeting, and you can see on what is the right-hand side of my screen, is a picture from the Center for Scientific Review of a study section. And this is kind of what a meeting like when we meet in person. So prior to your review, your grant is given to at least 3 people. You have a primary reviewer, a secondary reviewer, and a tertiary reviewer. Your primary reviewer is who talks the most about your grant. So study section, everybody read your grant, they write those 3 people they write a critique, they submit it, and give you a preliminary score. Inside section, what is those 3 people are the first to talk about your grant and answer the questions. Your reviewer has about 5 minutes to summarize your grant and discuss all the major score driving criteria they have that are either good or bad that result in the overall score they gave to you. Your secondary and tertiary reviewers have somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes each. And the idea is to address the differences between what the primary reviewer said and what their score is, to bring up anything else they think is wonderful or terrible, and to bring up all positive or negative critiques that have not already been addressed. The short version is what happens then is the floor is open for discussion, and every single person sitting around the table has the chance to openly discuss your grant, ask any questions of the reviewers, ask any questions about the grant, and generally discuss it. This discussion is recorded and written by the chair. And this is the summary statement you get when you have a discussed grant. So your chair sits down, they try to write everything and hit on every single high point that was addressed, and then they summarize the discussion for everyone in the room. And what happens is then those 3 primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers get a chance to adjust their score. And they say, I'm going to stay with whatever my score is, I'm going to go up, I'm going to go down. And then everyone in the room scores inside that range. You can score outside the range, but we're not going to worry about that. And then that's the score you get when you've had your grant reviewed. So your 3 reviewers are the primary driving factor. They are the ones who read every single page of your grant from start to finish. Everyone else has an opportunity to read your grant, can read as much or as little as they would like, but they are engaged in the discussion, they listen to the discussion, and they participate. So what you want is something, as Philip mentioned, that is clear and that is so this overview section, what I have done is I have taken a short screenshot from a standard blank grant review that the reviewer fills out, with the idea of mentioning a couple of points on each one, including highlighting, again, some of the clinical applicability points, which you have already heard a couple of, so they can be kind of driven in as you go through. So this overall impact score is what your reviewer writes, each of your reviewers, that is highlights everything that is below, that is what drove their score, that is the score you look at and care about when they read through everything you did. So the first thing that happens, of course, when you're going through each of the 5 scores now is your significance. So some of the questions that are going to be asked that you want to try to address is your topic area a significant research focus that fits within the research literature as it goes now? Are you addressing an important clinical topic or a clinical problem if it is that what you want to do EHR data and look at machine learning and writing something to the providers? On first glance, could you use either AI or machine learning to address this problem? And we talked about this briefly, and this came up in the first round of presentations as well, which is, are there enough data? Do the data exist? Can you get access to these data? And another is that it's important in the significance to say, what is the current state of the research? And will you move that forward or in a brand new direction? You are, as you were taught in likely something like graduate school, giving the reviewers the research gap here. You're and you're saying, here is an important problem we can use machine learning to solve. Here is how we are going to step forward, and here is how we are going to continue to create an entirely new research field. What happens next on the form is the investigators. And this is the, do you have the necessary or appropriate expertise on your team, or are you consulting with them? Something that comes up a lot in review section is, do you have an adequate amount of time allotted for people on your team to do the work you have said they are going to do. If you say that the crux of your proposal is machine learning and your machine learning specialist has 2% of their time in all of the years, that will not be smiled upon because it is seen as perhaps they're not going to be able to sit and complete it all. One of the things that I, as a clinical informaticist, bring up all the time is, did you include providers and did you include end users in your design? Even if you do not plan to implement during this, stop. Even if you do not plan to implement during this round, how do you know that you are creating something that is going to have clinically relevant results unless you have included providers from the start? You can answer all kinds of fabulous questions, but if they are not going to be able to be implemented and that is your ultimate goal, then you have already kind of shot yourself in the foot from the get-go. And so, for example, a good, easy example is I'm based in emergency medicine. So let's say you want to write a system that is going to predict something in the emergency department that uses all possible notes from the time the patient enters to the time the physician signs and finishes their note with their diagnosis, and maybe you need that diagnosis. This is a great idea and you could produce beautiful, wonderful results. But if you want to implement it into the emergency department, you should know that almost all emergency departments give 48 to 72 hours after a patient leaves before the provider needs to finish and sign their notes. And in most commercial EHRs, you can't access that note until it's signed. So what you really need to do is know what data are available at, say, hour 1. So you know what data you need to use to create your machine learning algorithm, or hour 2, or anything, so that you can provide a good enough result while you're doing things real time when you're thinking about long-term implementation. And the most important, I think, on the investigator and including people's side is your long-term goal should be a research field or project that continues to grow. It shouldn't just be a one-off grant. So you want to avoid the pitfall of developing something that's going to be developed and live in a silo. So on the innovation side, and Lang brought up a lot of really good points with innovation, is what you made new. Are you existing methods, but you're implementing them in new ways? And one of the other things to consider is, have you shown clinical impact on what your question is? And will you be able to, or will you be future? All your novelty does not have to be in developing your algorithm. You do not always need brand new code to do that. But you do need to show why you are doing things that no one else has ever done and why that's important. So maybe you're using existing algorithms, but maybe you have a really difficult implementation to make sure things are real time, like in the emergency department example. And that's what you want to push for innovation. Maybe you're the first person to do that, in which case make sure you have your literature in order so that you are the first person to do that. But also explain why no one has done this and why you are the right set of people to do so. So looking at the approach is, of course, the largest part for you of your 6 to 12 pages, depending on what it is you're going to be submitting. A lot of the things I'm going to bring up here, I think, are echoing things that Phil has already brought up in his presentation. So if you're designing an application that's a new and novel application, are you using end users? Do you have qualitative techniques? You don't have to, but if you do, make sure that you have qualitative investigators on your team. If you're going to be implementing this brand new and novel application, are you using any implementation science techniques to do so? You need to be able to tell the reviewers that you can tell the difference between when your application and your machine learning recommendations were put into care and whether or not the providers listened to your recommendations, and you assume that they have used your implementation. Is the problem if it is not used your implementation, or was it your recommendations? Make sure you can answer that question if your implementation does not go well. If it goes well, all is wonderful, but always plan for the worst, which brings up, which we have discussed before, always include alternative strategies for every single aim. I have in fact said this on many a grant I have reviewed. Ideally, your aims are entirely independent but related, but sometimes they are somewhat dependent, and that's a necessary way that you have to develop and implement something. That's okay, but you need an alternative strategy. If aim one is to develop your machine learning techniques and you have a certain criterion for when you know they'll be successful and don't need it, what are you going to do? Maybe you never need those alternative strategies, but you need to have them because you cannot predict everything that's going to happen. And the other thing, which I feel Lang is well discussed, did you describe the development of your system? Have you stepped through everything from not just the algorithms you plan to use, why and why not, but to how you are going to define success in both algorithms and clinically? What happens a lot is people say, we're going to apply the following algorithms, and then that's it. There's not, we're going to use PRAUC, there's nothing. There is no way for us to tell how you're going to define success of your system unless you tell us how you're going to define success of your system. So on the environment side, the couple of things that are important to bring up, one of them is, do you have access to your clinical data or any necessary data that it is you say you're using? Can you show you have access? Do you have the appropriate processing capabilities or the ability to access them? Does your institution do research implementations? And if not, why not? And if so, do you have the appropriate letters of support from people like your CIO or your CRIO to show that they are going to help you implement this, that you are going to be able to get it in the time you provided? So when you look at some of the additional scoring criteria, we talked about this briefly with human subjects. But with human subjects, a question that comes up a lot when I'm reviewing then is, who are your actual subjects when you are writing this? Likely, they are your patients. So you have patient data that you're going to look at. And so you need to show how you're going to protect that. But if you are also implementing, your providers or your end users are also your subjects, because you are examining what they do and studying the response. So you need to have two separate sets of sections if you're going to have two separate sets of subjects. With this, as part of all of your grants, you address sex as a biological variable. And these are actually what you see here, where there are drop-down boxes for the reviewers, where it's basically adequately addressed, not adequately addressed, or not applicable. And so when you look at this, who is included in your grant? Is it all genders? And if you are excluding anyone, why? So if you are doing a study on, say, prostate cancer, maybe you feel okay saying I'm excluding all females. And all you have to do is justify any of your decisions in your approach so that your reviewers say, yes, they thought about it. I understand what their inclusion exclusion criteria are and why. Along with all of these, this is the right place to kind of discuss bias in machine learning algorithms. This is something that comes up a lot. People are worried about having bias. The short answer is, if your data are balanced going in, you're more likely to have a balanced and unbiased machine learning algorithm coming out. This is between you and your statistician. I have not pushed it, but I would almost always also suggest having a biostatistician on your grant. It is not 100% of the time necessary, but it frequently is. Maybe you have an unbiased population, a biased population for any number of reasons that you are pulling from. You and your statistician can work out how to make it unbiased so that you have a nice generalizable result, so that you are creating your research to be continued to be generalizable and applicable to other hospitals and not just yours. There are a couple of other short things that happen. These are all non-scoring things that frequently do not come up in the clinical informatics machine learning based study sections for us. I'll just touch on a couple. One of them, of course, is resubmission, which we have talked about. And the important question is, did you address the prior critiques? And if you did not make changes that the reviewers recommended, why not? Because the reviewers at the end of the review and all three people are done, your chair is going to say, did they adequately address prior critiques? And your three reviewers are going to say yes or no. And if no, they are going to explain why not. And that is indeed frequently going to lead to cranky reviewers. The next one of those is that last round of additional criteria that sometimes come up, sometimes don't. One of these is your resource sharing plan. It's a checkbox, it's acceptable or unacceptable, but if you're creating code, are you sharing it? Are you making a GitHub repository? Are you creating something that goes into a centralized place for a commercial EHR? Or are you doing all natural language processing and therefore you are never going to be able to adequately de-identify all of those clinical notes and you are never going to be able to share it? All you have to do is say so, is we will not be able to share our resulting data set, however much we might want to. And so a handful of slides that continue on the theme of kind of thoughts and opinions from your reviewers. Considerations that always come up in looking at people's implementations is our end users involved throughout the process. From the beginning of algorithms that happens here is your end users will trust if they helped develop it because they know what went into it. And so you are more likely to have good uptake or side. The next is, do you have a robust implementation? And so can you tell why people did not use your system or follow recommendations? Do you have the information you need when you need it? And are you providing it when the providers or the users need it? And something to consider actually at the very beginning, which is, do you have a clinical outcome that can be measured? Are you making a prediction or anything like that that you can make from existing data? To answer some of the questions with us splitting review sections, which is, are all review sections the same? I've sat on a lot of different review sections, most of them as an ad hoc member. The answer is yes and no. Each section will have a slightly different expertise of its reviewers. CIDH has more implementation, decision support than other sections, and that's part of why it was split up with the VCHI split, so that there was a little bit more of a focus on that in the section. All of your reviewers are well qualified. All of your reviewers have written their own grants, have gotten their own grants. This may be their first review section, but there are plenty of people who it is not. So in a way, everybody knows what's happening, but everybody is trying to do the best thing for the grants. And do not forget, as Philip mentioned on talking to your program officer and your scientific review officer, each institute has their own priorities. We, as the review section, we are only focused on your science. We are not focused on how important it is to your institute. So even if your grant scores all ones, but your institute is not looking to fund something in that area. So if you replied to the general R01, but did not try to target a specific institute, it may not get funded. So talk to your program officer early, talk to your program officer often. They are there to help you. We, your reviewers, can only say, this looks like a pretty good plan. Like, it looks great for us. What's the next one we need to read and discuss? And then along with that, my one comment on grantsmanship is always have as many colleagues, mentors, peers, and friends read through your science before you submit it. If you have problems, you want to hear it from them. You do not want to hear it from us in the study section. You want someone else to read through it and someone else to say, hey, I'm really worried you didn't include an alternative strategy, because that isn't going to impact your score if you address it early. But if you have one of us say it, we're going to say, look, this seems like a really good idea, but if it fails, they have some problems. And so with that, I think we're ready for the open panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. We have already got some great questions from the audience. Let's start with the first question on the innovation aspect. Philip, in your conversation, you talked about the 70-30 rule, about being innovative, but don't fall off the edge there. The question from the audience is, in some of the RFAs, they talk about a high risk, high reward RFA. How do you interpret those kind of RFAs?
So I'm smiling because I think the challenge there is the difference between what the RFA says and how the study section behaves. So I'm going to give you sort of an honest piece of feedback, is that even when there are funding programs that people are responding to that are meant to be high risk, high reward, study sections tend to struggle with evaluating proposals that are 100% high risk and high reward, even if that's sort of what the language in the funding announcement calls for. And so while I certainly think that in some of the high risk, high reward funding mechanisms, you could shift that 70-30 split a little bit farther into the innovation bucket, I would be very cautious about writing even one of those types of proposals that was 100% high risk, high reward. That induces a lot of discomfort amongst the study section members, and it will lead to more critical conversation than you probably will want around your proposal. So I'm going to ballpark, I'm going to say that, I might push a little bit more to maybe a 50-50 or even a 60-40 split, sort of flipping the version. But I would, again, want to emphasize, I'd be very cautious about writing a proposal that was 100% high risk, high reward. And there is a corollary to that. And I know I'm not supposed to say this, but I will say it anyway. Some of these mechanisms like R21s, R03s, the funding announcements expressly say you don't need any preliminary data. It's very hard to compete for one of those awards with no preliminary data, because there will be R21 and R03 applications in the pool that have preliminary data accompanying them. And therefore the study section will inevitably, whether expressly or sort of, in a sort of indirect way, compare and contrast the proposal that has no supporting data versus those that do. So my answer is really driven by the psychology of the reviewers, not necessarily the language that's in the funding announcement. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you, Philip. You have done a wonderful analysis of the psychology and psychodynamics of the review panel. I'm very much, I really like your classify the group into three groups, the reviewer into three groups, the champion, the accountants, and also the rule followers. Thank you, Philip. Any other comments from the panel on innovation?
I wouldn't say directly related to innovation, but before each grant type is discussed as the panel, there is a very short overview, maybe 5 minutes about it. So if there is a very specific, like the Trailblazer R21s, that's all about being super high risk, that is discussed prior to everyone starting their review discussion. So there is a chance to say this one's very, very special and very called out, so that is kept in mind during the review section.
Great. Great. Long, do you have any other things to add on this one?
Not really. I agree with Philip's comments about high risk, high reward situation. We don't want to be too innovative. It's a lot of risk on that.
Great.
And by the way, I feel compelled to say, Simon, it pains me to say that. Like, I actually think, I'm going to make an editorial comment, because of the current psychology and the way in which these proposals are reviewed, we tend to invest in incremental science rather than science that can create sort of leapfrogging, movement in our given field. And I think that's a broader philosophical conversation, but the psychology of the study section plays itself out to the point that Judith and Lang made. And I just think, I wouldn't want anyone to walk away and think that I'm advocating that only incremental science is a good idea, because I actually take issue with that. I think it actually slows us down in terms of advancing the field, but it is the reality of how funding is received.
So next, we will move on to a discussion about resubmissions. Philip, in your conversation, you talked about the grant submission life cycle, and the resubmission is part of our life. We do observe in some cases, after a resubmission, the score dropped. And Judith, you talked about the resubmission. There is a section the chair asked about, do the applicant address the concern of the previous reviewers? So I'm wondering what if there's some detailed comments from the panelists here.
Judith, did you want to go first? I have a story about this, but I maybe you'd like to go first.
Oh, I will be very brief then, because I want to hear the story. So you are told and you review the grant as if it is a brand new submission. You review everything, you get an introduction to the application that addresses what they've done, but you review the grant as it is a standalone new grant. And then when you are done, that is when you get the previous study sections, all of their comments and all of their notes, the same things that the reviewer got that in the old days were the pink sheets. And you get to say whether or not they have addressed all of those things. So there is a chance that regardless of whether or not you have addressed them all, your new set of reviewers may think your grant is not as strong as your first set of reviewers. However, if you have addressed everything they have said and you have worked towards explaining why you didn't address it, most likely they're going to try to be lenient. We don't want to give you a 9. We want you to do well. We want our grants that we review to be really good and to explain that they've done a great job.
Yeah, so I'm going to shift perspectives. So I've been speaking from a study section member, but I say we often don't share our failures. So I'm going to share an example of exactly what we just talked about. So I was part of a proposal. This was actually close to 4 years ago, which I'm gonna try to protect the names of certain funding agencies, but I'm probably gonna do a bad job of this. But I was involved in a large programmatic application here at Washington University that focused on how could we implement genomic decision support at the point of care, primarily in community settings and really community oncology settings. And this was in response to a very specific funding mechanism that broadly addressed this issue of genomic return of results. We put together a project which included, actually, if you're familiar with program projects, 4 different projects and 3 cores. I think it was a phenomenal application. It leveraged our strength in the McDonald Genome Institute, our very large-scale cancer center that has a 300-mile catchment area, including a lot of rural sites, put it in, actually got a score of right around 22. So what one might argue for a first submission was a really great score. However, our funding agency, because it was a multi-funding agency program, decided to withdraw from the program. They decided they no longer wanted to fund one of these proposals. And we had focused on a particular disease area, cancer. This is where I'm doing a bad job of protecting the funding agency, because of a specific piece of language in the funding announcement saying they were looking for a program that addressed cancer needs. So 22, great program project on the first submission, funding agency withdraws from the multi sort of funding agency program across NIH, and we don't get funded. But the funding agency comes to us and says, the institute that withdrew and said, we're still interested in the project, but we want you to submit it as a standard program project grant through our parent mechanism. So we submit on the next cycle to the parent mechanism for this funding institute. It goes to a different study section, but they do allow us, because of what transpired, to include a response to the prior critique from the Trans NIH initiative as though it was a resubmission. New study section reviews it, comes back with a score of 36. So now, right, we've dropped 14 points. So we are out of scoring range, but we are told by the funding agency, we still like your proposal. Please revise and respond to this new critique and resubmit, which is what we do with yet another introduction to the revised application. But unfortunately, this funding agency uses ad hoc panels for these types of grants, so you don't get the same panel every time. Went in the third time and got a 42. So 22 to 36 to 42. And this was basically the same proposal that started out with the 22. So why am I telling you this story? Not just because I feel that it's cathartic to tell my trauma of this really great funding proposal, which, by the way, we've now decomposed into a series of R1s and competed independently because we were done with the program project mechanism. But why am I telling you this story? Because the issue that sort of drove what happened with those resubmissions was having a different set of reviewers every time. And I think that's really important, because while you get to write a response to the prior critique, you're likely to get new reviewers, and they could have very divergent opinions from the prior reviewers. And there's nothing to prevent those divergent opinions from shifting the discussion and the ultimate score. And so there's very little to protect against that, other than really thinking very critically around what's in that critique and trying to sort of discern what the conversation was in the study section that drove that critique, that study section chair tried desperately to write down so it could be conveyed to you, and trying to reverse engineer how you should respond, not just necessarily to the very specific items, but what is the sort of trajectory of that critique, trying to sort of understand that. And that goes to my other comment, which is why if you have an opportunity to sit in the study section, you should, because then you'll be able to understand like what really happens in the discussion and how does that manifest in the critique. So I know that was a super long-winded answer, but I also want you to know this happens to all of us. This is not an uncommon story.
Thank you, Philip. Philip, you mentioned about the program project. We know in this AI and machine learning domain, sometimes we can submit individual projects. Sometimes multiple researchers would aggregate together and try for a program project or a much larger funding program. So I'm wondering from this panel, do you have any comments on the size? Is it true you are safer with a much larger group, it's too big to fail, or it's really convoluted to prepare a very large proposal, spend too much time, it doesn't worthwhile? So I guess the truth would be it depends. So I really want to hear from the panelists.
It's a super complicated question, Simon. So first of all, I'm going to say that I don't think that there's more security in a large program project grant than there is in an individual investigator grant. What I do think is a couple things. So number one is sometimes for some of the higher risk, higher reward work that we are interested in when we start bringing sort of machine learning, deep learning, other cognitive computing methods to the table, it is more fundable when it's embedded as a project within a broader program project, because that program project provides the driving biological or clinical problems to inform that work, which may address one of the really critical concerns that reviewers may have. And it also helps us to sort of achieve that sort of 30-70 mix or thereabouts I talked about before. Some of the other components of the program project are a little less sort of high risk. So for certain types of projects where we're really trying to push the envelope, I would argue that the PPG mechanism, program project grant, and all of its sort of derivatives is quite powerful. I will say, however, when you talk about a program project grant, it's not something that you should enter into lightly. And practically speaking, I have never been involved in a program project that has been successful without first having some sort of internal institutional investment to allow the team to work together, demonstrate that they can work together, and produce some preliminary results and papers. Going in with an entirely de novo team with 2, 3, 4 projects and multiple cores and sort of none of the sort of track record of collaboration, that is a bad plan for a program project. So the first question is, if you're considering this, is is there an institutional mechanism? So for example, here at WashU in the cancer domain, in our cancer center, we have what we call the Siteman Investment Program, the SIP program. There's a specific mechanism, which is basically like a sort of large 2-year R01 that's entirely internally funded, and you can compete for that to sort of bring your team together and do the preliminary work before you go write the program project. And I would say that's pretty common in a lot of cancer centers. There are pilot mechanisms through your CTSA that also help bring teams together. So if you're looking at something and you don't have an existing collaborative team with some track record, I think the first question is, can you really compete for that program project? And then the last thing I'm going to say, and then I promise I'll stop talking, is don't be afraid of big R01s. Everybody writes their R01s, like I feel like, especially new investigators, like I'm just going to do a modular R01 because I don't have to deal with the detailed budget and all the rest of that. Trust me, our clinical colleagues and our basic science colleagues are not submitting modular R01s. If you have a big project with a multidisciplinary team and you need more resources than a modular R01, write a bigger R01. There's a lot of latitude in that. And it turns out those review just fine if you can justify the investment. So sometimes people go, okay, it's R01 or it's PPG. But when they're doing that comparison, they're doing modular R01 to like PPG or say, I don't know, some complex U01 mechanism. And we're not even talking about cooperative agreements right now, which is a whole other beast. What about the middle? What about the big R01 project? And I think in the informatics community, we need to get more people writing big R01s because I think that's sort of the bridge to broader funding. So just some food for thought.
Thank you, Philip.
And my colleagues can feel free to disagree with me. That was a whole lot of opinion I just put out there. So
I want to echo a little bit on this as well. I think if you're talking about AI machine learning in this field, I think a lot of opportunity we have seen so far is largely R01 opportunities. I haven't seen too much of the P grants, and there is one group of grants. I think all the biomedical informatics faculties are competing as data coordinator center grants. Some of them are more geared towards data integration. Some are more geared towards knowledge-based development. And some of them are more geared towards just engaging, research field. Okay, so more like a patient or research field engagement. They have different flavors, I would say. Our department has been, competing for this during the past couple of years. I would say we are kind of successful in terms of knowledge developments as well as the patient engagement. But however, in the data integration side, we're not there yet. I think we're missing some key expertise in terms of ontology developments, data integration capacity, and I think we're not totally there. But in machine learning expertise, we have adequate people over here already. So that's what I can say from OSU side. Yeah.
Thank you, Long. Our next question is on the topic of team science in the context of data science and AI. We know for those applications, we really require a team on both the data analytics side and also on the clinical side. And in many cases, there is implementation science component also. So the question is, are there any logic on who should be the lead PI? What are some of the particular expertise is viewed by most advantageous by the reviewers?
I'm gonna talk about this a little bit. We see a lot of MPI grants in our study section simply because the diversity of expertise in order to address many, I think, research questions in this field. We oftentimes see 2 PIs. And we also oftentimes see more than 2, sometimes 3 PIs. That's reflecting the challenge of this field where we'll require people who has the skills computing as well as skills of clinical application as well. I don't see a problem as justifying 2 or 3 PIs in the grants because that's the nature of this translational AI and its application to clinical science.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to echo Lang's comments, from my vantage point, some of the best proposals I see, if the sort of end goal is to have the project be translational and yield something that could be put into the sort of real world of the clinical enterprise, is sort of a three-way partnership at sort of the top level of leadership. And that usually involves someone who is a clinical champion and subject matter expert. It involves somebody who has sort of the computational or data science methodologic understanding of that sort of intervention strategy. So that's really more the computational person. And then somebody with more of an informatics or evaluative sort of slant, somebody that understands how to sort of do the evaluative work to get that model from sort of theory to practice. And so it's like a three-legged stool. And by the way, I actually see the same thing happen with students. I am a big believer when you put teams of students together in your lab, you want like a mixture of like a computer science, PhD or master's, a clinical informatics fellow, and an informatics grad student. And sort of magic happens when you mix those together. I think the same thing happens with multi-PI teams. And I actually think multi-PI teams are more competitive in most of the grants we're talking about right now. When I see single PI projects that are highly translational, I have a lot of questions about whether or not that single PI truly understands the sort of full scope of the project. Because I actually don't believe there's such a thing as a single human being who is a translational scientist. I think there's some people that might claim that they can do the full stack of translational science, but I think most translational science is done by multidisciplinary teams.
I think that Lang and Philip are absolutely correct. Everything in informatics is highly collaborative, almost no matter what. If there is a reason that you and say your clinical lead are not co-PIs, I might actually put that in the bio sketch. If there is some compelling reason why that person, whichever site it is, cannot be the PI. Otherwise, I would just make sure that you address in your multi-PI plan, like it is easy to justify, we needed the informatics, the clinical, and maybe translational expertise. And so we're all in this together.
Wonderful. And here is a follow-up question. If the applicant and the leading applicant of a grant is not a computer scientist, but has the domain expertise in the on the clinical side, for the training and build a track record from that point of view, what can the applicant do to make himself or herself stronger for an AI grant? Is it going to get some certificate, get some training, publish some related work, present at a conference, or all of the above?
So maybe, for starters, I'll tell you, and this is just, again, I feel like I'm providing a lot of opinion, so take this with a grain of salt. I'm much less impressed by people like, oh, I took an online course or I got a certificate. I want to see publications. I want to see that you could execute a project using these types of computational methods and generate results that in turn can, be translated into like peer-reviewed publications that your peers agreed was scientifically rigorous. That means everything to me. And the new BioSketch format provides ample opportunity to amplify those points. So publications and a publication track record is really important. I do have one corollary to that, which is, and this is one of those like pet peeves that I have, is when you get a clinical PI that clearly does not have AI expertise, has not published in the domain, has not had training, and basically writes a grant where it's very clear that they've read a few articles. They put a bunch of, sort of buzzwords in there about how they're going to do, random forests and, so on and so forth. They might have a grad student or they might have a collaborator that's a co-I that's sort of a computer scientist that they've never worked with. That strikes me as a person that's sort of engaging what I affectionately refer to as the AI gold rush. They're like, I think there's a lot of funding in AI and I have an idea that I think is, appropriate for this. So I'm going to go ahead and write this proposal. I'm going to throw in a computer scientist and we get funded. It's going to be great. Reading a few articles does not put you in a position to do that sort of work. And I often label this as sort of practicing informatics and data science without a license. So I will say that I think there's plenty of clinical investigators that are able to do what I just described in the first part of my answer. In equal measure, there's plenty of clinical investigators that are like, well, I'll give it a shot. And I'm going to tell you, the reviewers that are informaticians and data scientists, we can tell the difference between those.
I would say that it's totally acceptable to be the clinician without a lot of AI experience if you have a really good team that you have developed, that you have either already collaborated well with, or to Phil's point, it is clear that they have helped write the application and they know what they're doing, and you have provided them enough time to do the work with you. If you write the application, it is clear that you do not know exactly what's happening. And that computer scientist or someone else didn't get to read through everything to say, this is the correct way to say it to describe everything we need to say. So I think it goes back to some of our other points, which were start early. Don't write it at the 11th hour and hope it will pass.
Thank you, Judith. In terms of starting early, I'm wondering from the panelists, from your observation at your own institute, what's the percentage of the people they are really procrastinators, and what's the percentage of people you have seen they can really start early, and usually how far ahead you have seen people preparing on a submission of a grant?
I like that everyone
curious.
Everyone laughs and smiles when you say that. So I got to tell you, Simon, it's like from my vantage point, I think far too few people do plan ahead. For some reason, the culture of academic medicine is like predicated on this like grant writing hero that writes everything down to like the deadline and is sort of driven by those deadlines. And that's sort of the accepted cultural norm. I'm not sure it actually lends itself to better products, and it's a curious sort of phenomena in our field. I would say it's a minority of people that actually do plan ahead. And I will tell you personally, the advice I give, particularly to junior faculty, is, if you think your pathway to success is to write 50 proposals a year for every deadline, I've got news for you. You're not going to be successful, because that's going to be 50 half-baked proposals. You're far better served by submitting 2 or 3 really high quality proposals that you put the time and energy into planning ahead. But that's a very hard thing to do. It's like almost like the antithesis of what your internal emotional drivers are as an academic. So I think it's far too few people. And I think part of it is we haven't created a culture that rewards that. And I think that's up to a lot of us as leaders to figure out how do we encourage and reward people for planning ahead and submitting smaller numbers of higher quality grants and provide them with the resources, for example, to do pilot funding. Because part of the reason I think why everyone's writing so many proposals and doing it so quickly and at the last minute is because they don't actually have the breathing space to do a lot of the preliminary work. Right. So they're like, I have to get this grant in order to do the preliminary work, even if they don't, necessarily want to say that in the proposal. And so I think one of the questions is, why don't we give people more runway? Much like I talked about, on the program project grant side, why don't we do that for other mechanisms? And that's a tough conversation. There's no doubt about it. But I got to tell you, it's too few people that are planning ahead. But the people that do plan ahead, I guarantee you, when you look at the numbers, they do better. The people that actually have the discipline to plan ahead and submit a smaller number of higher quality proposals, they do better. So the evidence is there. I'm just not sure we always surface it.
I want to circle back from last question of finding MPI collaboration. I think that's probably team building phase is probably more important than just writing a competitive proposal. That team building process has to start early. I think, we mentioned a little bit early on, say, whether physicians, scientists want to find a computer scientist to work on a grant proposal, right? And there's also, the other trend as well. There are a lot of computer scientists, junior faculty want to find the clinicians who can work with them building up proposal. When you see those junior faculty or even some middle faculty, the training background in computer science, they are not necessarily very specific on what application it is. They basically take whatever data they have and build some novel algorithm on top of that. Hopefully that can become a competitive proposal. But I have to say something about this. I would say we have to be a little bit more strategic on this, because I think, if you don't pick one or two areas to really focus on, spending your energy, spending your resource on that, and it's starting to, spread a wide net and trying to find many collaborators and building a proposal. I think the later case is sometimes is not going to be very cost effective, because the energy you have to spend on working with too many people, instead of working on a few people, which we can dive deeper and really understand the clinical challenge and the data, and trying to build a strong proposal. I would say for junior faculty wants to explore a collaboration with clinical faculties, I think spending more time, identify a few kind of areas where you can really invest resource, means that getting the data, train your student to build the models, and really trying to make impactful results, maybe even publish a couple of papers first. I think that's going to be very important to really build up a strong proposal later on. So that's what I see so far. I think this is something people has to think about it.
Judith, do you have any further thoughts?
I have a thought that's tangentially related, so it's sharing my opinion. What I think I would say to the junior faculty member and to people working on early things is there are a lot of really good ideas out there. The trick is, how do you package your idea so that it has the largest chance of success with a team, with the methods, with everything that goes together. The next weeks, you could wait 4 months for the next round and develop it so that you are selling it better. Think of it a little bit when you're writing a salesmanship. You don't only do it in 30 seconds.
Thank you, Judith. Our next question is more of a technical question on writing a particular section of the grant on the review part of what has been done before. How do you balance the in that section in the proposal for AI grants in terms of reviewing what's being done in the method section and what's being done in the application side? How do you balance these two?
I can answer a little bit on that. In my slides, I actually mentioned the two types of innovation. Okay, so one type of innovation is really innovation application. So basically saying that the methodology itself is not new, but application is new, right? And the second scenario where is that you're trying to promote the innovation on computing, means that the methodology is new, right? Once you identify innovation element, so if that's innovation you want to promote, then all those literature review and scientific premises writing has to build upon those innovation to claim that innovation. So that's my recommendation.
Thank you, Long. Any other comments from the panelists?
Well, I guess I just want to amplify one of the points that Lang made, is that you need to understand what your innovation is. Yeah. So, is your innovation around the core computational methods? Is your innovation around how they're being applied to a particular domain? Or is it, how the translational life cycle is applied to this work, or some combination therein? And actually, I think where people get into trouble is they don't acknowledge that. Like, this is the sort of thing where you literally can just say it in your proposal, right? We're not seeking to come up with a better machine learning algorithm. We're, seeking to demonstrate how we can create the evidence that would allow for this machine learning algorithm to be translated into a clinical decision support tool, right? And where people get in trouble is where that's not said expressly, and then it's left up to the imagination of the reviewers. And so, to Lang's point, the types of innovation, you should be able to make a clear, concise argument in your proposal what type of innovation you're actually arguing for.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to move on to a more general topic of the pandemic. So in the past year, how do you see the pandemic affect your life as informaticists working and collaborating with clinicians. We see the lab-based research at many institutes has been dramatically affected by people's access to their lab space. So I'm wondering in the AI space, what happened before, and especially as we are planning for reopening and looking for the future in the next 12 to 18 months, do you think we are going back to the normal? How does this pandemic affect the way we put research project together in general?
So, so for starters, I'm going to tell you a metric. The faculty in our Institute for Informatics submitted more grants this year in the past 12 months than they ever have before, all while they were actively working on operational projects to enable our clinical response to COVID-19. So what does that actually tell us? Well, two really important things happened. Number one is we took away a lot of bureaucratic and administrative barriers to accessing data and moving interventions from the informatics lab into the clinical enterprise because it was a necessity. And that actually led to a lot of credibility being built on the part of the informatics investigators in terms of being able to deliver things that have a positive impact on quality, safety, and outcomes of care. That's number one. Number two is we studied the health system as a health system, right, in terms of these interventions. And so I would say the challenge to all of us is that, how do we not go back? Because I'm going to tell you, like when people talk about going, returning to normal, there were a lot of things that were wrong with normal before the pandemic, such as a lot of unnecessary barriers between the informatics and data science community and our actual clinical enterprises, and then the populations that we serve. Likewise, there were a lot of unnecessary barriers around sort of the understanding of our role in delivering sort of solutions that could be operationalized and studied at scale. And so I have no interest in going back to the old normal. I wanted to find a new normal where our investigators are integral parts of sort of the operational teams that deliver these digital health interventions in our clinics, in our hospitals, and at a population level. That's why our investigators here submitted more grants than they ever have before. It was also a function, quite honestly, of a lot of COVID-specific funding mechanisms, which didn't hurt. But you know what? There's a lot of new funding mechanisms coming online right now around AI and post-acute sequelae, et cetera. There's always some new trend where informatics and data science is essential to the response. And so I would challenge everybody in this audience to think about, one, how do we not return to that sort of old normal, right? And number two, how do we keep this momentum? Because I think that leads to a much greater opportunity for us to secure funding, write papers, and have impact on the patients and sort of communities that we serve. And that should be our priority. And I will say in equal measure, this last 18 months has been incredibly hard for our bench science colleagues. We have had the advantage of being dry lab researchers that could do our work from anywhere, which is not an advantage that our bench scientists had, or frankly, in equal measure, a problem that our clinical researchers had in terms of the point of care. So we should not underestimate the impact on our colleagues and collaborators of the last 18 months. But for the immediate informatics and data science community, I think we've actually thrived in the last 18 months. And I hope others share that sort of enthusiasm, because I think we've seen what can happen if we take away a lot of those barriers. So that was like totally like my Chamber of Commerce pitch, but I think that is the future for our field.
Thank you, Philip.
Hey, this is Lang. I would say I agree with Philip in terms of the workload in the informatics world has increased. We see many colleagues, staff, faculty they're getting busier, right? They're writing more grants internally and externally. But the other thing I also want to say about the challenge is really about the interaction between students and the faculty themselves. I think that when I look at an individual lab, how do they managing their interaction with students? I see a little bit more challenge, because I think this is the faculty has less chance to be more hands-on with the student on their projects. So I really hope when we open up during the next few months, I'm probably going to see a bit more interactions more hands-on interaction between faculty and student. There, sometimes they need that to move the projects forward.
I would say that at Cincinnati Children's, overall informatics productivity did not decrease. It remained the same or increased, and they did a good, like everyone, again, we're able to do our work at home where other people may not be able to. And on the student side, on my own personal students, those that are more established did fine. They did better than those of our new students who did not have the opportunity to meet with people or the informal hall meetings. I think that hurts our collaboration in the long run a little bit when you can't say, oh, hey, Phil, I meant for you to meet Lang. Let's get together for 5 minutes after the faculty meeting. It's much more awkward and more difficult on Zoom. But everyone's existing research can continue ahead, and you can continue existing collaborations and build small new ones. But there has to be some minor in person as well.
Thank you, Judith. You mentioned about Zoom. In the clinical care domain, there is a huge transition of care from in-person to virtual. And afterward, we have a lot of reflections on moving forward, how we combine those virtual interactions versus in-person interactions together for the best delivery of healthcare to the patients. Now, on the reviewer side of the reviewer panel, we know previously the reviewer need to travel to Washington, D.C. for a review session, and there are often reviewers from the West Coast flies in, and they have a 3-hour delay. It's a long session during the day. The travel is quite some hassle for everybody. In the past year, there has been quite some review sessions. It has been done virtually. So moving forward, I'm going to ask you the same question. Where do you see the future of the review panel? Is the will the virtual review go away, or there will be a combination thereof? And what's your projection?
Well, so I, for one, really would like us to go back to in-person review panels, because I actually believe we've demonstrated that for a very lengthy sort of interactive meeting, such as a study section, Zoom is not as efficient. I think we've done well. We've gotten better at it. What I anticipate is going to happen is that we're going to continue to see sort of hybrid meeting formats because of sort of the new norms around travel. And I think that's important to allow some people to participate that might otherwise, because of family or professional obligations, not be able to travel to DC or another city. I support that. I think it's critical in terms of diversity of expertise and opinion around the virtual or physical table. But I personally, I'll tell you, for CDMA, I am advocating that this meeting that's coming up be our last 100% virtual meeting, because I think we need to go and figure out how to build these hybrid meetings. And I hope that we're able to do that. It's very, very hard to sort of have the type of robust interactive conversation that we normally have in a study section of results in what I think of as a very good, high quality review in a virtual format. That's my expectation. I think it's not a whole lot different than the challenge we have teaching online, and I could sort of get on my soapbox about that, but I think that's a similar challenge. But I don't know, maybe my colleagues feel differently. Maybe they really like the Zoom, the 2-day Zoom meetings. Sorry, that was a totally pejorative statement.
No, Philip, I totally agree with you. I think in-person meeting, study meeting will be much more engaging, much more effective, put this way, because I think a lot of times when in Zoom meeting, the 3 reviewers granted, they probably engage quite a bit, but the other reviewers may not at all. So I worry about that. And I think getting all the study section engaged on the review, I think is very, very important. Sometimes those things cannot be accomplished by the Zoom meeting at all.
I prefer in-person meetings. There are more distractions at home. One of them is sleeping on the couch right now. But I think it is very important that we find a way to hybridize them for people with young children, with family obligations, with other problems. We traditionally do not have as many women represented in study sections, and this is because the majority of childcare ends up falling on women, this is one of the ways we could help bring them in that would save a little bit of time.
Thank you, Judith, for bringing that perspective. For all the audience in this particular session, please do use the question and answer box or the chat box to ask questions. I will start with a new question here. Usually in a review session, we talked about for some of the AI review sessions, there could be hundreds of grants in a particular session. And some of the grants, they would, even by the preliminary review, they won't score well. And there will be some of the grants standing out, really standing out. So my question to the panelists is, do you have some stories or gut feelings makes you feel what makes a difference? What are some of the typical characteristics of those few grants? They will quickly stand out and above others, and out of dozens of applications. What are some of the common mistakes a reviewer might feel like the grant would go into the direction of score above 7?
Judith, you did such a nice job explaining the study section dynamics. I feel like this is right in your wheelhouse.
You know, as a reviewer, the first thing I read, so when you get the grant, your first couple of pages or paperwork type of pages, who's on the grant, and then you have the project narrative and the project summary. I have never tracked it, but I would guess that when your project narrative and project summary are not at all clear, I have bad feelings about how your approach section is going to go. If you cannot clarify exactly what you are doing and why, there are not high hopes that you will be able to discuss exactly what you are doing when you have 12 more pages. That it's just a feeling, and then you have to keep reading to see, because sometimes that's fine. They turn it around and it looks wonderful, and other times you're like, oh, okay. I would say that anything that it is true to work very hard on your specific aims page. Everyone in this section is going to pull up that page, even if they do not read your entire grant. And if your specific aims page does not make a compelling case, people will stop reading. Advice I was given many years ago in graduate school that I would pass on is at the end of your specific aims page, people should be done reading it and say, that is a really important problem. They have a really good way to solve it. I think it's a really good idea to give them money to do that. And so a lot of what makes the grant stand out one way or the other ends up being grantsmanship. Did you put in the elements we are looking for? Did you address things? I have seen grants without significance sections, without innovation sections, all kinds of things that are those 5 standard scoring criteria. And so you know they are out there, that they are coming. If your reviewer has to search and find where you put in sentences of innovation, it's not as good, because we know you didn't pay attention to all of the details as you were going through.
So could I just piggyback on one thing that Judith said? So I literally, when I write a specific aims page, the last 1 to 2 sentences of my specific aims page is an impact statement. What will happen at the successful completion of this grant? What will be different in terms of the state of knowledge and practice? And I literally put a box around it, like in the formatting, and say like impact, because that's the last thing that I want the reviewers in the study section to see after they read my specific aims. It's like, okay, if I like these aims and I fund this team to do this work, here's what's going to change. So back to my like use formatting to your advantage. That's a concrete example of like how you use formatting to your advantage. But I want to go back, Simon, to the question, you know, like, so I'll share in a study section like the former BCHI, now CDMA group, you know, we would have between 100 to 110 applications assigned to us for a 2-day meeting. So the practical reality is that in order to even have a shot of getting through that panel of proposals, we will have to streamline 50%, which is the maximum that NIH allows us to streamline. So those are the not discussed applications. Now, here's the thing. They have a review from 3 reviewers, and there is an opportunity for one of those 3 reviewers to rescue the proposal and basically say, hey, even though this went in the streamline bucket, I think it's worth talking about. And sometimes if you get a reviewer that really likes your proposal, that actually can turn things around. I don't know what the statistics are on those proposals getting fundable scores. I doubt they're very good, but at least it gets you closer to a fundable score. So you need to recognize, like, you really need, in my opinion, you need to be scoring kind of like a 4 or better in terms of the overall impact coming in from the preliminary critiques, in order to not be in jeopardy of being on that bubble. Like, that's roughly where it sort of the cutoff seems to lie statistically in most of the sort of cohorts of proposals being seen by CDMA. And then, to the question then, getting through it, you got to recognize that there's a review order. So we review those proposals from new investigators and early stage investigators first. That's an intentional approach to make sure that the reviewers are least grumpy when they are looking at those new investigators, and the senior investigators go later. And you can assume that as you get to the senior investigators that are later in the process, there will be less time available, because we always take longer on the front end, and then we get time crunched, and then we speed up towards the end. So practically speaking, especially if you're a senior or established investigator, you know that you got to make your case very clearly with those sort of 3 C's that I talked about before, so that your reviewers can get in there and sort of argue on your behalf when you're tight on time. So those are some of the practical mechanics that happen sort of behind the scenes in the study section.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Philip and Judas about the first impression through the specific ambiguity reviewer. That page is critical. If the reviewer can enjoy reading that page, that's really put your grant in a really good place. And then at the end of the day, I think I also want to emphasize a bit more the ultimate, to me, at least to me, the ultimate criteria for a really strong proposal, I think somehow has to lie with the innovation itself. I know early on when Philip talked about 30, 70 type of rules about innovation, but that 30% of innovation is critical. If we don't see that 30% innovation, the grants are not going to score well. But if that 30% of innovation is really standing out, and then demonstrate it's feasible as well, right? So in that case, the grant will be scored very well. I think that's my own experience.
You're muted, Simon.
So
I'm not a good lip reader, so we're going to be in trouble. Yeah.
So Philip talked about early stage investigators. Here comes a question. Do you have any specific suggestions for early stage investigators in terms of highlighting the potential of the investigator? Is it to demonstrate the capability to accomplish the grant besides publications? Also, do you suggest the early stage investigator to collaborate with more junior investigator or more senior investigator when they are applying for our grants?
So I think there's a couple things. So one, the BioSketch is a powerful tool to make your case. And I think it's, important to tell a story in the statement at the beginning, which is like, why has your sequence of training and preliminary research, et cetera, led to the point at which you are the right person to do the project that you're proposing? So that's when I was talking earlier, like, don't overlook these other parts of the proposal. Like, you can make a case there, and certainly with an early stage investigator, I think most reviewers will go and read the BioSketch of the PI in some degree of detail, and I think that's important. I think the other thing I would say is it's not always a bad idea if you are proposing a more complex project, say an R01 scale project, to include at least one established investigator as part of your team, but with 2 caveats. Number one is, I actually don't think that person should be an MPI, because then it sort of, is taken away from the ability of the junior investigator to establish themselves as an independent scientist and leader. And number 2, you need to have had some collaboration with that person before. So it doesn't just look like you're just grafting on like a senior investigator. Like this happens anytime you look at something and they're like, oh, and here's this department chair that's on the grant, right? No offense to the department chairs in this call, but you know, that's something that you need to be super careful about, right? It needs to look like you didn't just graft on your chair because you need a senior person on the proposal. I mean, don't get me wrong, department chairs are good collaborators. So I think Lang and I would both agree with that statement. But I think you need to be careful that the senior person, if you do add them, is somebody that you actually have a scientific relationship with.
I second that. Make sure your team is capable and you have worked with at least some of them. Show that you have you have the necessary expertise, and if you don't have it, you have found it somewhere in a way that you can easily work together. There is nothing wrong if you are personally worried or think the reviewers will be about saying, hey, we already have a weekly lab meeting and we all have worked together for a while and we have submitted these 4 papers, which, you know, may or may not have gotten accepted by the time you review the grant in 6 months. These things are fair to consider, but you get the bump as the new investigator and the early stage investigator of being the sole PI or being the PI with another early stage investigator. It's better, I think, likely from the grant's point for you to be the only PI, but show how you are going to develop your career and how you are going to make a future impact based on what it is you have written right now.
Can I give one important corollary to Judith's point too? For new investigators, people that have ESI, you know, or new investigator status, you should be very careful if you're invited to be an MPI on a proposal with an existing senior investigator, because that's basically the way I would describe it, is wasting your ESI status, right? Because you'll lose it if that, you know, R01, for example, is funded. And so, you know, sometimes senior investigators will be like, I'm doing you a favor by putting you on here as this MPI. Wouldn't that be great? And maybe you even have a really good scientific relationship with that person, but be very cautious, right? You know, that is a very precious thing, that sort of ESI and new investigator status. And you should be, frankly, if you're especially someone that's trying to establish an independent lab, you should be using that for your first R01 where you are the primary investigator, right? You're the PI. I cannot emphasize that enough. And that's a mistake that people make. They're like, oh my goodness, like I'm going to get funded by partnering with this person. You could, but you're losing an opportunity to establish an independent track record, which will just come back the next time you apply for funding.
And make sure your co-investigators know, like it is at some point in time when they become the senior investigators, it is their job to help promote you and make sure you, the new investigator, get that benefit, and that they are not accidentally robbing that from you either.
I want to circle back to the early comments of the, as a new investigator, the biosketch is very, very important, especially the publications. Because for new investigator, you don't have too many grants, right? And you don't have a lot of collaboration experience either. So the publication history is critical. That's how that's going to help you build up a case of for the grants. I think that's where for junior investigator, when you prepare your biosketch, that publication history and trying to explain what you have done so far, those are important things you needed to pay attention to.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Our next question is with regard to the preliminary results. Is preliminary result critical for each of the aims in R01 grant? For some of the data sets, you may not get access to the data yet. How do you demonstrate the preliminary results?
So I think broadly, your aims kind of fall into 2 buckets, right? You have like aims that are capacity building to get you to sort of your methodologic aims, and then you have those that are more methodologic or translational in nature. And I think it's okay, right? So like the capacity building, you know, if that's something that can only happen when you get the funding and you can get access to the data sets and so on and so forth, I think you can make a justification happen in that way. If we're talking about like, I've got this method and this method is going to result in something that's going to be clinically actionable, right? I'm going to build a predictive model, and this predictive model is going to allow me to better diagnose, you know, patients with a condition in the hospital, and that in turn is going to change quality, safety, and outcomes of care. You're going to need some data behind that aim that basically says like what you're saying is not just theoretically possible, but you have some reasonable experience to demonstrate that it can be done. And I think you kind of have to treat the aims as falling into those two broad buckets. There's a little more nuance to that. So that was a long-winded way of saying you don't have to have preliminary data for every aim, but if your aim includes a methodologic dimension, you know, it's going to take more than just you just saying that it's going to work. You're going to have to show some evidence that it's going to work.
You know, Phil, I'm probably going to lean towards for every aim, they probably have to have some preliminary data to demonstrate a feasibility. You know, I agree with you in the sense that, you know, different aim can have different scope, right? Some aim can be more computational driven, some aim can be more clinical or more implementation science driven. But whatever we propose for every aim, we need to demonstrate the feasibility. So to me, it's like there got to be something over there to show it's doable. Okay, it's feasible. And that's to me. I mean, my answer though is that we'll probably have to have something for every aim, but you have to demonstrate the feasibility.
I will say your preliminary data does not have to be unpublished brand new data. If your preliminary data, say you're developing your machine learning and then you want to implement it, and you have previous implementations or your team does, you can cite those and say, we have experience doing this, so we feel relatively assured that we'll be able to do it again. It doesn't always have to be brand new, wonderful, novel things that no one in the world has ever seen before. It can be showing you have experience in this field and you can continue to do so.
Thank you, Judith. We are approaching to the end of this panel. So for the audience, if you have a question, please do ask in the Q&A box. I will start with a completely uncorrelated question with AI or grants or those topics. We have a long Zoom session so far to get everybody know the panelists better. I'm going to ask a personal question. What's your favorite summer vacation spot?
You got me, Simon. You know, I honestly wanted to fly back to China, visit my parents. So that's how it is. It's been a long, I think, more than 1 year already. And then think, you know, there's a lot of things going on back and forth. And I think, you know, to be with a family is, to me, is a big deal. I really hope hopefully during the next 6 months, we can open up a little bit travel, then we can, you know, travel back a little bit.
Thank you, Lam.
I am going to give a slightly less magnanimous answer and say that I took my child to Rocky Mountain National Park in our effort to start visiting national parks, and we had a lovely time together. He's 13, and so he's just old enough to still want to spend time with his mother.
Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I mean, for starters, I ended up in a position, I think like many of my colleagues, where I was leading an analytics team that really supported our entire health system's response to the pandemic. I was sort of drafted into doing that. So I spent 18 months basically only doing hospital operations and then doing sort of my academic job sort of on the side. And in a lot of ways, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to do that, because I think it goes back to some of my prior comments. I think we demonstrated the real world impact of informatics in the delivery system and for our populations that we serve. But it's an intense place to be. I share with people, I describe it as follows. During the pandemic, we went from measuring success if you were a researcher in months or years to measuring it in hours, or maybe if we're lucky, days. And that's a really tough place to be. And I'm glad we got to do it, but now I'm trying to figure out how to demobilize our team and my own work. And I feel like I haven't spent as much time on the teaching and learning and sort of research areas that I'm passionate about. So I'm looking forward to doing that, but that's not an easy transition. We talked a lot about it, but there's a little bit of an adrenaline rush that goes along with constantly operating in crisis mode for 18 months. So that's on the professional front. On the personal front, I'm a person that used to fly, 120, 150,000 miles a year between personal travel, but also, I have a lot of international colleagues and collaborators, China, Taiwan, India, South America, and multiple countries. And I miss being able to travel and spend time with my family. And I miss being able to travel and spend time with sort of my professional family as well. So to Lang's point, I'm looking forward to that getting better. I have a 9-year-old daughter, so I'm also looking forward to getting her vaccinated so that we can actually travel together as a family, because that's kind of the final missing piece for us. But I think this next stage, truth be told, for this audience is going to be very hard for a lot of us that have sort of navigated the last 18 months, because this is sort of I know it's overused, but an unprecedented time for us in our field. And I think a lot of people rose to that challenge, and I'm very proud of what the informatics and data science community has done. I think the story of COVID and sort of where we're at, as much as we're sort of really enthusiastic about the basic science that made these vaccines possible, and we should be, in equal measure, I think this will be a story about the power of data to drive response to a 100-year public health crisis. And I think there's a lot to learn there. So the question is, how do we move forward from that? And I know my team is struggling, to truth be told, to sort of demobilize and go back to this more normative mode of operations. That's probably more of an answer than you wanted, but it's cathartic to say it out loud, I guess, like all the pieces.
Thank you, Philip. I think we had a wonderful discussion panel. I do not see any more questions come in. So I would like to thank the 3 great panelists telling us the myths, the things behind the review panel. And also, I appreciate all the researchers in the biomedical informatics domain. We had a very challenging year, and all of you are doing great works to make real world impact. And we all believe the future is going to be better. We will have a bright future, and that's why we are spending time and working hard on writing grants, because we always have the next brightest idea we believe it's going to change the world. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
And I believe this is the last session of this conference.
Yeah,
you want to comment more
we'll
on
see each other
that?
tomorrow. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.